What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you guys know that this is another 2-hour Megamix. If you guys are enjoying the daily uploads and these longer videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this one. I think about 1,500 likes is a good goal for these longer 2-hour videos. Doing all of the above really helps out the channel and to make sure that I can continue to do these for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts of making these videos is reading your guys' thoughts on the stories therein. Without further ado guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you guys again at the end of the video. Have a great day. I live in Chicago, so taking public transportation is a major thing in my life. Anyone who lives in the area knows that if you live or work or go to school close enough to an L station, it can make your life a whole lot easier. Also, contrary to what you might hear on the news or from other people, being in Chicago is not actually as dangerous as you might believe. There are absolutely bad and dangerous areas, but the crime is almost completely concentrated in those areas in particular. I live on the north side. I take the red line a whole lot, and I always feel safe when I do. There was one time, though, when something so sketchy happened on the red line that it really scared me for a long time. This was back when I was going to school still. I didn't live on campus. I had an apartment in Rogers Park instead. I needed to use some library resources for a paper I was writing, so I stayed at school until it was very, very late. As I was finally making my way to the Red Line station, a thunderstorm began to break out. I was on the bus taking me to the station already, so it wasn't that big a deal at first. I was really hoping the storm would end before I had to walk from the station to my apartment, though. There weren't very many people on the train I got on, which was not unusual for this time of night. I can't recall exactly how late it was, but it was definitely pitch black out. I got on the train and immediately noticed this one guy who was making me very nervous. One of the things, whether you're walking in Chicago or taking transportation, is you follow the eyes forward, mouth shut rule. You definitely don't stare at people, and this guy was just staring at me non-stop. After a short period of time, I pretended to get a phone call. I got up while talking and started to move toward the front of the car. I moved into the next car and walked all the way to the end of that one. It was just so uneasy, his stare. I felt much better once I'd gotten away from this strange guy. It didn't take very long, though, before the door between the cars reopened and the guy moved into the car I had just gone to. Even though there weren't many other people around, he didn't get too close to me. He sat at the other end and pretended to be casual, but resumed his staring at me. Just like before, he didn't look away at all or even blink while he was staring. It was making me very scared at this point. I decided I would simply get off at the next stop that had people on it and wait for the next train with them. As luck would have it, the very next stop there were plenty of people waiting on the other side of the platform, so I got off. You could only imagine the feeling I had when the guy who was staring at me waited for a moment and then got off as well. I kept trying to tell myself that I was unlucky and I just happened to pick the stop he was going to get off at anyway. Unlike everyone else who got off the train, though, he made no attempt to exit the station. Instead, he went and sat down by a guy who was playing a guitar and just stared at me. Since I didn't leave either, he must have suspected what my ruse was. He just kept observing me, and I really didn't know what to do. This was before Chicago started putting guards on the L, so I didn't have someone like that to go to. I decided I would actually leave the station. You guessed it. As soon as I started to move, the man got up and began following me. Needless to say, I was very scared going up the steps to the next exit. It was the first time I truly felt I was in some sort of danger on public transportation. If I got out onto the streets and was still alone, I wondered what this guy might do to me. I hit the luckiest break of my life, though. There happened to be an attendant in the station who was already talking to a police officer. I exited through the turnstile and made my way over to them. Looking back, I noticed that the guy got to the exit and must have seen the officer too. What did he do? He immediately turned around and went right back down the steps. That was the final thing I needed to see to know that this man wanted to do something nefarious to me. I didn't even tell the officer what happened. Instead, I went outside where it was still storming and found a bus stop. I decided I would wait out in the storm and just take the bus as far as I could before maybe connecting with the L again. I never did see that guy after. Chicago is a big city after all. That's one of its best features. You can see a person you don't want to meet again, and you'll never see them ever again. I really enjoy storms. I mean really enjoy them. And I don't just mean thunderstorms either. I like normal rainstorms, I like windstorms, I like snowstorms. As long as it's a type of storm, I tend to enjoy it very much. I live in a somewhat run-down neighborhood. I mean, it's not that bad. There's not really a lot of violence or anything like that. But it's definitely the poor part of town, and there are more than a few weed dealers in the area, if you know what I mean. For the most part, it's pretty quiet. The houses are all pretty old, and I didn't know my neighbors at all really. Usually, in the very late fall or early winter, we got some really rough windstorms. This one evening, we got one where the wind was about 25 miles per hour or upwards. It got dark very early at that time of year, so it was already dark at this point. To make matters even worse, I don't know exactly when this happened really. The wind was so strong that it broke a tree that fell over onto the power line and knocked out the electricity for the entire neighborhood. This left me with very little to do. I didn't have candles to read and couldn't get light from any other source. I decided I was going to go outside and sit on the porch and observe the storm. It was pretty cold outside, but I wrapped myself up in a blanket. I had a chair sitting on the porch that I sat down in, and the blanket kept me plenty warm. It was pretty dark outside, and it was pretty cloudy too. There was no light from the moon. After being out there for a while though, my eyes adjusted enough that I could see, and it looked really cool outside. Most of what I saw was pretty neat. At one point, I watched a garbage can from who knows where, just rolling down the streets. The wind was really stressing the trees in the area too. I was watching them swaying and stretching. Occasionally, you could hear the groaning sound of one of them bending too far. Now, it's important to understand just how dark it was outside. I mean, it was very dark. I doubt anyone would have even been able to see me sitting on the porch looking out over the neighborhood. Across the street, 2 houses down, I suddenly heard a noise. Looking over, I noticed a shrouded figure standing in front of the door of a house. I could only make out very minimal features. Obviously a man, though. The sound I'd heard seemed like a door slam. I got the impression that he had been kicked out or something. The man began pounding hard on the door, so hard I could hear it clearly over the sounds the wind was making. He was yelling at whoever was inside to let him in. His voice sounded crazed, but he didn't sound drunk or anything to me. After the banging continued for a while, suddenly I heard the sound of a gunshot from his direction. It was only when he said that he would light the place up that I realized he was the one to fire the gun. I froze in my chair, now truly scared. I heard the man yell something, like, "Oh yeah? What are the police gonna do about this?" That made me think that whoever was in the house had called the police on him. I watched and waited to see what would happen. After a few moments, the man fired one more shot and turned and ran away from the house, hurrying down the road. The scariest thing was, he was hurrying right up the street right to where I was. I remained absolutely still. Like I said, it was dark out, and I was shrouded by my porch somewhat. I was still scared the man with the gun would notice I'd witnessed the entire event. Fortunately, though, he hurried on by, didn't even look in my direction. I guess I was hidden by the darkness. It wasn't long before I heard a ton of police sirens coming that way. I figured at this point it was best to go inside my house while I could. I assume the police caught up with the guy and arrested him, but I don't really know what happened. In the area I grew up in, there was a story about an old abandoned psychiatric hospital that supposedly housed some of the craziest people around. There were various stories about the place, most of which were probably not true. The most consistent one was the place had been closed down from malpractices. It was supposedly shut down in the 1960s. The hospital was built way out of town in a rural setting. I always thought this was because they wanted to keep dangerous people away, but I've since learned that mentally ill people are mostly not dangerous at all, maybe to themselves really. I mean, some definitely can be, but most are not. I guess that the country setting was more of a thing to make it tranquil for the patients so there weren't as much stressors. Well, my friend Eric and I often talked about wanting to go out and find that old hospital. We supposed that it might be haunted, and that would make it a lot more fun to try and explore. However, it was something that we talked about more than we actually went about doing. Finally, when we were both 16 years old, we decided to go out and actually find this place. Other teenagers had told us before that they'd gone out there and had smoking and drinking parties. They even told us where to find it, just in case we ever wanted to go out and see it. The forests around the area we lived in were pretty dense, but that didn't stop Eric and I from trying to make it through them. We eventually came across a barbed wire fence with no trespassing signs all around. The other guys had told us that indicated we had reached the property the hospital was on, so we knew we were getting close now. It didn't take too long before we found the place, and it was pretty impressive when we did. The building was huge and definitely showed its age. What surprised me the most, though, was that all the windows remained intact. I always pictured all abandoned buildings with all windows broken. We needed to find a way to get in, though. To cover as much area as possible, we decided to split up and go in separate directions, looking for doors or broken windows. Obviously, we didn't want to break anything ourselves. If we got caught, that would just put us into even more trouble. I went to the back of the building, and Eric went toward the front. We told each other we would meet up on the other end. I never made it to the other end of the building, however. After walking for a while on the back side, I came across something very unexpected. At a back entrance to the building, there was a van parked there. A couple of men were by the van, and they appeared to be moving something. Two other men showed up, carrying something else which they put into the back of the van. I didn't want to get caught by these guys, so I quickly went back in the direction I had come from. I realized I would have to try and catch up with Eric, rather than meet him at the end of the hospital. I made it around to the starting point and started walking along the front of the building. There was no sign of Eric anywhere. My guess was he had already made it to the other end, so I just kept walking until I got over there. Imagine my surprise when Eric wasn't there either. I crept around to the back side of the building and peered around. It looked like the men had finished loading their van and were about to go on their way. Fortunately for me, they drove off in the opposite direction. I had been really scared of getting caught. I felt safe, but I wondered where Eric was. This was the spot we were supposed to have met up in, but he was nowhere to be seen. I looked around everywhere for him, thinking that maybe he was searching for me as well, but I couldn't find him. I wondered if he'd gotten inside somehow. I couldn't figure out how he might have, though. The man who I came across locked up the entrance they had been using, and I couldn't find any other way to get inside. After looking for him for a while, I figured I should wait in one place. If he was searching for me, then me constantly moving around would keep him from finding me. However, I waited for hours, and he never showed up. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave the area without my best friend. I also thought he may have been in danger. More hours passed by, and he did not show up still. Finally, I decided the best thing to do was to go home and get the police involved. The police searched all over the area, but were unable to find Eric either. I was worried I would never see him again. About 2 days after this happened, though, Eric did in fact make it home. Whenever he was asked what happened to him, though, he would get a conflicted look on his face and simply claim he'd gotten lost in the woods. I never believed that. Other than exploring the woods, he never talked about anything else. He never explained why he'd left the hospital area to go back to the woods. He denied ever seeing the men I had seen with the van, but when I brought it up, there was a look in his eyes that told me he knew more than what he was telling me. He had seen them and possibly interacted with them. I could tell by how scared he was when we talked about it. He never told me anything, though, other than I got lost in the woods. I had a really creepy experience once when I was out taking a hike. Although I was hiking in a national park, there were areas where one was not supposed to venture into. I always just assumed that people would go out there anyway. Only hiking in areas you're allowed to hike in is not very fun, really. Although you could face a fine if you were caught by a ranger or someone else in one of those areas, I figured a little bit of money was worth the risk in order to have a fun adventure. I won't name the specific park I went through, but just know it's a pretty large one and not located in the United States, if you were thinking that. My plan was a 5-day hike out through the woods. I had a map of the area, so I was pretty confident I would not get lost. On the first day, I hiked pretty deeply along the official trail, but when I found a good opportunity to get off trail, also by remembering the spot I had gone off of, I went off into the forbidden area, so to speak. The first day was pretty uneventful. I mean, the hiking was good, but I didn't run into anything strange befitting a scary story exactly. It was just a normal and enjoyable hiking day. It was the second day when things began getting a little strange. I kept hearing noises that made me think that someone or something was also walking in the general area I was in. It began making me very nervous, thinking that someone may have caught me going off trail. What was also worrying was thinking it may have been a dangerous wild animal of some sort. The possibility of running into a bear was pretty frightening. At least a park ranger wouldn't try to kill me or anything. The noises continued throughout the entire day. I heard breaking twigs mostly. Whenever I heard one, I would quickly turn to look in the direction they were coming from. But at least on that second day, I didn't come across anything that I could see. The second night in my tent was a bit unsettling as well. I kept hearing noises that indicated that someone might be stalking around outside. I looked out the tent several times, and even called out hello to see if anyone was there. I was past the point of thinking it might be a ranger, because a ranger would have already arrested me rather than creep around me. A wild animal was the conclusion I had come to. Eventually I had to fall asleep though. I needed my rest to continue. It was on the third day when I was out hiking that I finally noticed something. On this day, I had to sort of turn back in a curved direction to make it back to the trail, so I could make it back home on the last day. I heard a twig snap again, and my head immediately shifted toward the direction of that noise. When it did, for just a brief moment, I could see a man standing off in the distance. He quickly darted away and out of my sight, but there was no doubt I had just seen a man there. Like I mentioned before, he could not have been a park ranger. If he had been the source of all these mysterious noises I had been hearing, that meant he had been following me for days. This made me extremely uneasy as I continued on my way. The occasional noises continued all throughout the day, but I never caught a glimpse of the man again. When I made my camp and tried to relax for the night, I found that I couldn't get very comfortable at all. My mind was too focused on the guy I had seen and wondering what he was up to. Eventually, despite hearing occasional sounds such as twigs breaking, I was able to fall asleep. I woke up to something very odd though. A fire was burning outside my tent. I always put my fire out before going to bed. I'm a very responsible camper that way. Not only that, but some of my things were missing. I kept everything rationed out exactly in order to have the right amount of food for the trip. It seemed really odd to me to even think that maybe the guy who I had seen might have started a fire and heated up some of my food. I mean, I guess I could understand if he was hungry, but he could have just asked or approached me. The fourth day, things began getting even worse than before. I was still hearing those noises that made me believe the man was still following me, but I've been catching more and more glimpses of him too. Whenever I shot my head around in the direction I thought I had heard him, I would see him for a split second before he'd dart out of sight. Each time it happened, it made me hurry up further along the path. Whoever this man was, he was behaving very strangely, and that meant he could be dangerous. Going to sleep that night was very difficult. A few times it seemed as if something impacted my tent. It was as if someone was throwing pebbles at it or something. I began thinking the man I had seen was getting bolder and bolder each night, and that was not a good thing. This would be my last night in the woods though, as by sometime the next day, I would be making it back to the official trail. Eventually, I fell off to sleep again. Well, the fifth day was the worst of all. I didn't have another fire or any missing food, but the hatchet I had brought with me to cut firewood had disappeared. I had kept that inside my tent with me while I slept. It was hard for me to admit to myself that I was really scared, but I was. I had my hatchet with me for protection, and now it was gone. That meant the man had gone into my tent without me waking up and had taken it from me. The last day was a little different than before. I didn't really hear many noises and began feeling a bit of relief. It seemed like maybe the whole thing was finally over. Sure, I was missing my hatchet and some food, but it felt like there was no real harm done, other than being a little scared of this guy. At one point, though, I heard a different sort of noise. It was a loud chopping of wood. When I turned to see where it had come from, I got my best and longest glimpse of the man who had been following me throughout these days. He had what I assumed was my hatchet and had thrust it into a tree. He pulled it out while I was watching. He stood there, hatchet in hand, and simply stared at me. This time, he made no attempt to move out of sight, and no attempt to hide from me. I didn't know what to do, except go along my way and hurry the hell up while doing so. I kept looking back over my shoulder to see if he was following me, but I only saw him standing in the same spot until I was too far away to see him. He may not have been following me anymore, but that didn't keep me from moving as fast as I could. I wanted to get back as quickly as possible. Maybe an hour after seeing him, I made it back to the trail and began following it in order to get out of the woods. I did catch many more glimpses of him, clearly watching me from afar, but he made no further attempt to come after me. I got out of the woods without any further problem. The worst part of the whole story, though, is I couldn't even report the guy for what he was doing. If I did, I would have to admit the fact I had gone off trail. Besides, I wasn't sure anyone would even believe me if I did tell them. Other than stealing my stuff, he hadn't done anything directly to me, but he was deliberately following me and antagonizing me. His message was pretty clear: to not go off trail into his neck of the woods. I enjoy finding old caves and abandoned mines to explore. For the most part, nothing scary or such happens when you explore these places. They can be plenty creepy and make you nervous, but other than that, they aren't really anything special. I'm never really scared when I go exploring one of them, because I've done it so much. The only time I ever did get scared when exploring happened about 30 years ago. I had been researching and found a mine that I really wanted to check out. It was a bit of a hike to get to it, as is often the case with these places, but it's normally worth it for the experience. It took me a while to find this old place, and when I did, I almost second-guessed myself about trying to explore it. It was very run-down looking and had wet ground. I often try to avoid some of the places that are really wet like that. I decided that I had come out all the way through the woods to find this place though, so I might as well check it out at least a little bit. I went down into the mine. I don't recall offhand how deep it went, although I think I did know at the time. I wasn't going in blind at all. If it got a lot wetter as I went downward, I could always turn around and be confident I had given it my best try. It seemed fine as I went deeper and deeper. The water didn't really rise up in any significant way, so I was enjoying myself. Then I began hearing this strange noise. I can't really explain it exactly, but it was a sort of clicking noise. Imagine someone taking a pen and flicking it against a blackboard over and over. Combine that with the fact that I was in a mine and it was echoing over and over again. That was what I was hearing, and it got louder the deeper I went inside. I was really curious what this noise was, and was already more excited about the experience than before. The noise was very consistent, and it wasn't a dripping noise either. It was a constant echoing clicking sound. I was following this mysterious noise when it suddenly stopped altogether. I stopped too, but only because I was wondering why it had ceased. That was when I heard a different sound. It was a growling sound, which also echoed off the walls. It was a low guttural growl, basically telling me, "I think you had better leave." I wanted to turn around and run right out of that mine, but part of me thought that if this was a dangerous animal, it might chase after me because I was acting like prey. Rather than turn around and run, I slowly began walking backward. I did that for a little while hearing the growling continue on and off. Hell, even when the growling ceased altogether, I did not turn around and run. I was too afraid to do that. I did eventually turn around, but I just kept walking very slowly until I finally made it out of there. I didn't feel safe right away, but I did hurry away once I'd gotten out. I don't know what exactly I experienced in there. I don't really know enough about wild animal growls to pick out what animal I might have offended. Plus, the clicking sound was something I couldn't explain at all. I wish I had a tape recorder on me at the time, so I could have recorded the whole thing. Unfortunately, I didn't really see the point of taking a recorder into the mine with me at the time. Whatever it was, I took its warning seriously, and that was likely my best choice of making it out there alive. It all started with a simple knock on the front door. That knock led to months of therapy with a child psychologist, a fear of going outside, and parents so stressed out that I was never allowed to answer the door for strangers again while living under their roof. And that's for a very good reason, mind you, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Growing up, my parents lived in a quiet, well-off cul-de-sac in West Virginia. We had an upstairs and a finished basement that served as a lounge area. I remember my childhood being filled with extravagant Christmases and birthdays, and little treats every week just because. The neighborhood was very safe for children as well. The neighbors all looked out for one another in their own way, and I thought as a kid that nothing bad could ever happen to me and my friends. Now, as an adult, I realize I had a very blessed childhood that much of the world doesn't have the chance to experience. At least until this incident, that is. The day of the incident itself, I was 6 years old and left with a babysitter who didn't really know how to watch little kids. She was 16 and not used to looking after younger siblings. I thought she was okay enough, though. She awkwardly put on the movie Cars for me and sat down on the couch to do homework for a couple of hours, eventually moving to the kitchen table because her laptop needed to charge. By that point, I was on to The Incredibles for the second time, and I was incredibly bored. I remember mindlessly staring as I thought about what else I could do. I'd read my books a half a dozen times, and in order to use my paints, I had to ask my babysitter for help. I could see she was busy typing away and talking on her phone, though, so I really didn't want to bother her. As any bored 6-year-old would, I decided to wander the halls in search of something to play with. I had a large playroom, but nothing there interested me at the moment. I thought about grabbing the mattress off my bed and sliding down the stairs, but even that lost its appeal when I considered that the babysitter would yell at me, or even worse, tell my mother. As I passed by the front door, though, I heard someone knock very quietly. I looked at it for a minute confused, not really doing anything. The babysitter probably hadn't heard it at all, so I thought I should answer. My mom and dad let me answer the door in the past, so I thought it would be fine even if they weren't there. I walked up and opened the door. We had a screening door that was made of textured glass, so the person on the other side looked blurry, like they weren't actually really there. I could see that whoever this was wearing a black suit and carrying something blocky in their left hand. Maybe a briefcase if I had to guess. Not that I knew what that was at the time. "Hello," the man said on the other side of the door. His voice was deep and confident, like he was expecting me to have answered. "Can you open the door so we can talk about something?" Something about the way he said that made me pause with my hand on the door handle. My parents might be mad if it was important, though, and I missed something that they needed to hear. I ignored that strange feeling and slid open the screen door just a crack. I didn't want to disturb the babysitter. There was a man as tall as a tree to me, and very intimidating on the other side. He smiled down at me. "Thank you. Are your mom and dad home?" "No." "Are you alone?" "My babysitter's here, but she's doing homework, so I shouldn't bother her." "Oh, well, that's okay, buddy." The man knelt down to my level and looked me in the eyes. "I'm here to see if your parents want to donate to the animal rescue shelter. You like puppies and kitties, don't you?" I said yes and told him all about my own cat. The man in the suit grinned and matched my enthusiasm. He seemed especially excited. I wondered what he was going to say next. "You know," he continued, putting a finger on his chin, "I have some kitties looking for a new home in my car. You want to see some?" Suddenly, my whole day lit up. My parents would probably be mad if I just brought one into the house without asking, but I at least wanted to see them. I mean, what little kid wouldn't? "Yeah, sure," I told the man, flinging open the door. "Do you have any kitties that look like mine?" The man winced as the screen door banged against the side of the house. He stepped off the front stoop and looked around nervously, as if he was expecting someone to come running. He didn't want to upset the babysitter, is my guess. Once he was sure that no one was coming, he turned his attention back to me with another wide grin. "Come on," he said. "They're really friendly." He grabbed my hand, and that's when the first feelings of "there's something wrong here" hit me. My parents and preschool had taught me about stranger danger and to never go off with people I didn't know unless they were an official. but the man seemed official in my eyes. Besides, I'd be right in the yard, so I wouldn't really be going off with anyone at all. I could see his car parked on the street still running. The man opened the door to the back seat. I didn't see any kittens at all. When I pointed this out to him, he put his hand on my back and said they were in the trunk. He walked me over to the back end of the car, and just as he was about to open the latch, a shout came from the door. I looked over and saw my babysitter frantically sprinting over to us. She started screaming for help and yelling at me to come over to her right now. She yelled at the man to get away from us, or she'd call the police. I remember I started crying as the man got into his car and sped away, begging her to see the kittens. I didn't understand what was going on. She hugged me and carried me back inside. This time, she didn't go back to her homework. She called my mom on her cell, crying and whispering something, before coming back to sit with me on the couch for another movie. A lot earlier than usual, my parents came home. They saw the babysitter wringing her hands and watching me like a hawk. They took her into the kitchen to talk, where she told them everything that happened. They came out to talk to me. I was still sad about the cats. That's what I remember focusing on in that moment. That's when my parents told me I was never allowed to answer the door for a stranger again, no matter what, not even if they were right there. At the time, the incident didn't really bother me much. I was able to go about my life as normal for a few weeks, minus going outside without my parents. Then I started getting an uncomfortable feeling in my gut though. The same uncomfortable feeling that blipped in my head when the man grabbed my hand to take me to his car. It was more like a wave than a simple blip this time though. Soon, every time I had to go outside, that feeling invaded my head until it was all I could think about. I didn't know at the time why I was feeling this way, but growing up and taking a look at the incident through a more adult lens made me realize I was processing a trauma I didn't have a name for. My parents were true to their word. I never went outside without them again. Not that I wanted to. I went to see a child psychologist once a week to help me process the incident fully, as it might have grown into full-blown agoraphobia if left unchecked. Eventually I did move on, but I had a new understanding that not everything in my neighborhood was quite so safe as I thought it was. I could have been shoved into that trunk under false pretenses and never been heard from again, and that fact is scarier than any childhood fear of boredom. My mother recently reminded me of this story, and to this day it really freaks her out. To start with some background and context, she worked at the time in a small hospital that especially prioritized efficient cohesion with employees across all departments, even more than normal hospitals from my perspective. I'm talking many group activities hospital-wide, like pizza parties, mandatory Secret Santa games, and other such events. It always struck me as very strange, almost cult-like if I'm being honest, and I'm happy she's moved on to better opportunities. Anyway, this incident really kicked off when she arrived to work one chilly morning and found a mysterious bouquet of flowers sitting on her desk. It was around 8 a.m. after a blizzard and a harrowing drive, and she was pretty groggy, so they didn't register for a moment. After some coffee, she really took notice. They were fresh red roses and smelled good as if they'd just been watered and plucked that morning. The note on them simply read, "I love you, Dr. X." Needless to say, my mother felt uneasy. She was married, and everyone knew that, so it was really inappropriate for anyone to be sending her flowers with that kind of note, even if it was just a joke or something. She didn't know what to do with them, so she just kept them under her desk wilting away out of sight. After a while, she forgot about them, and life continued on as normal. At department meetings, she would briefly wonder who would have sent her the flowers, but every time she would come up empty. She didn't contact anyone outside of work unless she absolutely had to. and even then she kept it reasonably professional and not buddy-buddy like the hospital all but mandated. More flowers and notes from the mysterious Dr. X began to appear, once a week almost. The flowers were always fresh, and the note was always intensely inappropriate. My mother was really starting to get uncomfortable. She logically knew that she should report it to HR, but she knew the department would probably dismiss the behavior as a coworker wanting to get to know her better. Hell, they might even tell her to just reciprocate. As I said, it was quite creepy and strange there. None of her coworkers had acted any differently towards her, at least not that she noticed, and aside from the increase in the flowers, nothing else had really happened. Then came the day where Dr. X left strawberry Twizzlers. She had them pretty often while at her desk, but only when there, which could only mean that this person was someone in her office, or at least someone that walked by and observed her regularly. This family pack of Twizzlers came with the most disturbing note yet. "I bet you taste like candy. I'm gonna find out one way or another." And that was the final straw. Despite thinking it wouldn't help, she reported the harassment to Human Resources. As expected, they didn't do much to help or ease her worries, citing the fact that she couldn't identify the perpetrator, so they couldn't take any action at all. Just like I thought, they even had the audacity to say the behavior of her admirer was not that bad, and taken in the wrong context. My mother all but called it crap and left the HR office. This continued for a while, when just as suddenly as they'd arrived, the mysterious gifts from Dr. X disappeared, and they stayed gone. That was around the point that she decided to leave the hospital. A friend of mine recently told me this story, and it's creepy as hell. Made me rethink my life choices a little bit. We were talking to pass the time at work, and the topic of creepiest or weirdest experiences came up. You see, a couple of years earlier, she'd spent some time in New York City while in college, and that provided a ton of opportunities for meeting people, bustling fun, and crazy shit. She described to me that one night she was invited to a party with a group of friends on the other side of the Bronx from where she lived. It was an absolute rager, tightly packed and soaked in every type of booze imaginable, maybe a few drugs as well, but my friend wasn't really paying attention to anything specific. She said she and her friends stuck tightly together as a group and had a good time laughing and getting drunk just like they had planned. Hey, none of them had to work the next morning, so who was anyone to judge? The first problem of the night came when they had to walk home, though. None of them could drive, and although she'd taken the bus there was no way my friend would be getting in an enclosed space with strangers while drunk and all alone. As much as there were pitfalls, walking part way with her friends felt a lot safer, at least for a while. One by one, the group went their separate ways when they got close to their respective homes, until only my friend and one other girl were left. She said the other girl asked if she'd be okay walking the rest of the way all by herself, and my friend reassured the woman that she'd be fine and to get herself home. That was that. She started the long, dark walk back to her place. The shops along the way had been closed several hours ago, so the usual store lights that lit the way were gone. There were the occasional party-goers heading home like she was, but for the most part the streets were completely empty. She remembers that part of the walk being a blur, kind of muddled, as the alcohol was still working on her system. She remembers feeling brash, even singing to herself and breaking into dances in the middle of the street, not exactly keeping her guard up there. She was about 3 blocks away from home when she noticed a group of guys hanging out in an alleyway just up the street. They were smoking, and she smelled the smoke from afar. According to her memory, they were completely average, nondescript guys, the kind of people you would pass by on the street during the day and think nothing of. One of the guys noticed her, held out his cigarette, and called out to her, "Hey, pretty thing, want to have a smoke with us?" My friend was pretty sure she told them to fuck off, especially after they started catcalling her with more creative lines. The men wouldn't stop calling after her though, and eventually she looked back and realized the entire pack had begun to follow her. They walked really slowly, not speeding up to catch her or slowing down to give up either. She was starting to get nervous. The alcohol made her eyes swim, and even though she was starting to sober up, she didn't think straight. She didn't think to call the police or even take out her phone. The men followed her even as she turned down several blocks, always at the same distance. They were quiet, except for when one called out again, telling her not to be scared. "We just want to hang out for a while. Come back here." She had no intention of doing so, obviously. She kept walking. The night was getting cold and she shivered, but with every minute that ticked by, her head was getting more clear. She could feel she was still drunk, but she was able to get her phone out and hover her thumb over the emergency call button, just in case. She turned another corner with the men still following her, and her street came into view. It was only then that the thought hit her. If she continued, they would know exactly where she lived. Maybe not the exact apartment, but the building for sure. They could easily force their way inside and ambush her at any point, or even wait outside for her in the morning. She turned left onto another street, purposefully walking past her building. She thought that maybe if she lost them, she could make a big circle back later. If she couldn't, she would call the police. She looked back, and the men were a lot closer now. She couldn't run, though. They were faster than her, and if they caught up, she'd be outnumbered. She told me she wished she'd begged her friend to walk home with her after all. She checked the time and it was 1 a.m. Would anyone even pick up her call? She realizes now it's ridiculous to think 911 would close like a JCPenney's, but in the moment that was her second biggest fear. The biggest was the group of people following her. My friend walked for 30 more minutes as the men continued to follow her, taking random left and right turns. Eventually, she came to a late-night bar that was just closing for the evening. People scattered left and right in groups of 3 or 4. She knew this was her only chance to give the group the slip and ran up behind a group of girls. She acted over-dramatically excited, yelling at the top of her lungs, "Oh my God, girl, I haven't seen you in forever!" The girls looked confused at first, but when she looked behind her and back at the men who were still there, she hoped the group would help her out. Something clicked and they immediately accepted her into their group. She told them what was going on, where she lived, and that she was tipsy and scared to be alone. The group of girls walked her along for a few minutes, keeping her in the middle of the pack. When my friend dared to look back again, the men were now gone. It worked. She thanked the girls and told them she'd be fine now that the men were gone, but they insisted on walking her back all the way. My friend was touched by the gesture and allowed them to walk with her. She never saw those girls again, but she always wished them well whenever they came across her mind. That said, she never took the risk of walking alone at night again either. My parents own a temple. It's not a big one, but it was a little weird to be the kid at school with the religion background. I guess I stood out a little. I wasn't ever ashamed of that, though. The odd thing about my family's temple was the fact that my father performed rituals, exorcisms, and memorial services. I guess that sounds a bit strange, but what if I told you he didn't perform his services on people? He did his work on inanimate objects, possessions, things that looked human but were not quite. Human dolls and stuffed animals, things like that. I didn't ever get creeped out by the presence of all these dolls and things because I grew up with them being in our home. However, there was one doll in particular that made me kind of double take every once in a while. It was this really lifelike looking baby doll, one of the ones you had to feed with a bottle if you know them. I was used to people bringing in their childhood toys and dolls for my father, but I had never seen one like this. I was about 10 years old at the time this happened. I remember I woke up in the middle of the night and needed to use the bathroom. Just after I left my bedroom, I stopped in my tracks in the hall. It was dark and in the dead of night, and I expected everyone to be asleep. I could hear a noise though. It sounded to me like a cat meowing. It was so weird. Maybe not a meow exactly, but more like a cry of distress. It was coming from the room where my dad held his services, and even though I was upstairs, I knew exactly where it was coming from. I couldn't help myself. I was young and curious. Before I knew it, I was creeping downstairs to investigate. It was incredibly dark and silent downstairs. The whole house was asleep, and the only sound I could hear was that crying cat-like noise. I went into the room where my father did his work, and I hit the lights. There were a lot of dolls in that room with me, and I found it quite creepy at nighttime in there. I never liked that room all that much anyway. It was almost as if all their eyes fixated on you while you were in there. I heard a scratching noise coming from a box in the corner of the room. I thought, probably because I was so young, oh, there's a cat trapped in the box. I thought someone may have accidentally given my dad a household pet or something. I don't know why they would ever do that, but that was what my thoughts were. So, without too much thought, I began to tear the box open. I pulled back the thick layer of duct tape that held it sealed and opened the lid of the box. As soon as it was unsealed, that crying and meowing sound suddenly stopped. I looked into the box and there was not a cat at all. It was a doll. I could feel a chill blast through me. It was one of those types that if you move it in a certain way, its eyes open and close, like you can make it go to sleep or whatever. Do you know those ones? It was so scary. This box had been making that noise. The second I opened it, it fell silent once more. I backed away from it. There was something not right about this. I put the box back and quickly ran back to my room. I went to sleep. I didn't want to think about it anymore. In my dreams, I saw something I didn't dare to believe could be possible, though. I pictured that box, and the doll's hands rising up to grope at the sides of it, as if looking for some kind of leverage to hoist itself out. I woke up screaming. I heard rushing of feet along the hardwood floor, and turned just in time to see my dad enter the room. We went over to check it out, and he saw that the box was on the floor, and the doll was lying flat on its back outside of it. He quickly closed the lid with the doll inside, and firmly sealed it with packing tape again. He turned to face the corner I was cowering in. He came to me and scolded me, and asked what I was doing down here so late. I told him in all honesty that I'd heard a mysterious crying sound. I said I'd heard the sound coming from inside that box. He let out a really loud sigh and shook his head. Next time you hear something like that, you come to me and let me know first. I later learned that the doll in the box had been brought to my father by someone in our town. It was supposed to be burned the following morning after a ritual. When the morning came, it was burned on schedule. I wasn't there for that part. My dad told me later when I was a teenager that he thought he could hear some noises coming from inside the box every now and then. When he retrieved it, though, there was only a mass of burned plastic and ash inside. From then on, sometimes when the cats at night cried out and meowed, I would think about that doll. Nothing really happened beyond that experience. But I still think about that doll sometimes when I hear cats in my city at night, even though I'm miles and miles away from my hometown. I just want to mention that dolls feature fairly prominently in Japanese culture. They're treated differently than regular toys or ornaments, often being a part of a family for years. It's thought that some dolls hold memories or even souls, so disposing of them can be wrought with problems, with many people feeling incapable of simply throwing them away. Many people believe there will be spiritual repercussions and consequences of some sort if they do that, so ceremonies help owners to say goodbye in a more dignified way. Prayers would be said, the dolls would be purified, and the shrine or temple would deal with the disposal. an event that makes for a slightly odd sight as thousands of old companions and former family treasures are displayed for one last time and said goodbye to. Me and a good friend of mine, Zach, were going together to a mutual friend's wedding in Wyoming. They'd chosen to get married in the same small town they grew up in, which was somewhat inconvenient for everyone else. But who am I to say? It's their wedding after all. Zach and I found a nice Airbnb nearby and took his car across a few states to the middle of Wyoming. This town was mostly made up of farms with a small central area for groceries, food, and some small businesses. On the outskirts, we'd found this Airbnb. It was a farmhouse as we'd expected, but it had so much land around it that we didn't expect. The home was almost entirely isolated from everywhere else. Looking off in any one direction, the only things visible would be grass, trees, and the dirt road that led here. We unloaded and unpacked all our luggage inside. It was nice. I wouldn't compliment its looks too much, but it was great for a couple nights' stay. Zach and I spent the rest of the day just kinda hanging out and talking, going to bed by 11 o'clock or so. I took a while to fall asleep. I think it was because the house was so far out. It just made me feel kind of uneasy, you know? Once I did fall asleep, though, I slept pretty deeply. In the morning, we went to the wedding and spent the entire day there, not getting back to the Airbnb until at least 9 or 10. Zach went to bed right away, but I stayed in the living room to relax for a little bit longer. It was only 10 minutes after settling in, though, that a single quiet knock came from the front door. I got up and was feeling very strange. Why would someone be out here this late at night? I quietly walked over to the door and looked to see who it was, but when I checked, I didn't see anyone out there. I opened the door and stuck my head out a bit, looking all around the driveway. Everything was empty as far as the eye could see. There was nobody outside, it seemed. After a few moments of confusion, I shut the door once more. I looked over at Zach's room. I knew he must have already been passed out, so he probably hadn't even heard it at all. I assumed it must have just been a noise from the house that simply resembled the knock. It was a quiet sound, after all. Everything pointed to it being nothing. I sat back down to continue resting. But not even a minute after sitting, a quiet noise knocked from the outside of the house. This time, though, it was from the other side of the home entirely. I quickly got up and rushed over to the back, turning on the outdoor light. I looked out the window, but again, there was nothing. This furthered the idea that it was just the house making these noises, but it still didn't take away from the unsettling nature of it all. I stayed by the window for a while. It had been about 5 minutes, looking out into the backyard that led to the forest. It was pitch black outside. I was hoping that by seeing nothing was out there, I'd be less on edge, but actually it only unsettled me even further. There was just something about being out here in someone else's farmhouse that gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I stayed up for a while longer, wanting to be sure nothing else was going on. I decided to try my hand at getting some sleep finally. I went to my room, which was across the hall from Zach's, and laid down in bed. I didn't hear anything else, so I slowly drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, my eyes shot open immediately. Someone was knocking on my bedroom door. "Hello? Zach?" To my relief, I heard Zach's voice from the hall, asking me to come out for a moment. I got up and met him in the hallway. From just one look at him, though, I knew something was wrong here. He looked terrified and worried. "What's wrong? What's going on?" I asked. He explained that he'd woken up to something moving around outside his window, and when he moved the curtains back, he saw the backside of a man walking around the house. As we were discussing the situation, clicking sounds began coming from the front door. Both of us ran over to the living room. A man was out on the porch, standing with his body right up against the door. He was clearly fidgeting with something, which made me sure he was trying to pick the lock. I turned and looked at Zach in fear. I think he knew exactly what was going on without me having to say anything. He ran to his room and called the police, while I stayed and made sure this guy didn't get in. The only thing I could really do, though, was hold the lock and hope he wouldn't disable it somehow. I could hear the man outside getting frustrated. All of a sudden, he just ran off to the side of the house. Both of us were too scared to check the windows and opted instead for locking ourselves in one of the rooms and waiting for the cops to arrive. If I'm being honest, though, the rest of what happened was very uneventful. The cops pulled in a long while later, gathering basically no evidence and never getting any idea on what happened that night. I don't know who that guy was or why he was trying to break into the Airbnb, but if those noises I heard earlier in the night were from him, then he had been skulking about the house for several hours and knew that he was breaking into an occupied home. That only makes the whole encounter even more terrifying. A few years ago, I lost my phone. I just remember one day coming home from work and realizing I didn't have it on me. I tried to remember where I could have possibly left it, but I honestly had no clue. I worked a pretty normal office job in the city at the time. I would have to walk several blocks to get to my car, then would drive home. It didn't seem likely to me that I would drop my phone, but I honestly had no clue where it could be. The next day when I went to work, I looked around my cubicle, hoping I had forgotten it there. I thought it had to be there. I hadn't remembered dropping it or any situations where it could have slipped out of my pocket or something. I guess it was possible, though. After searching my desk and all around it, my phone was still nowhere to be found. I felt completely dejected. I realized that probably meant my phone was a goner, especially if I'd lost it on the city streets or something. It certainly would not still be there. I logged onto my computer to work after that and figured I would have to buy another phone later. When I was checking my email, though, I saw a new one. It had the subject of cell phone. My eyes lit up when I saw this. Could somebody have found my lost phone? I clicked on the email and read it. It was short and very to the point. Whoever said it said they'd found my lost phone and got my contact information from it. They wanted to give it back to me as soon as possible, but asked if I could pay a finder's fee of $400. My happiness went away after reading that last sentence. A finder's fee of $400. I really hoped that was a joke. That cost more than my phone itself. I responded to the emails, saying I would meet them as soon as possible when they were available. I added that I hoped they were joking about the $400. The sender of the email did not give me a name, and it was from a Gmail account with just random letters and numbers. They responded to me within the hour and told me they were not joking at all. They really wanted $400 for the phone. I would rather buy a new phone for more money than give whoever this was the satisfaction. It made me pretty angry they thought they could do that to me. I asked to meet with the person and didn't say if I would pay them or not. The person said they would come to my house that night and asked me for my address. I responded saying I would rather meet in a public place, but they didn't respond to me after that. All of our communication took place within this one workday. At the end of the workday, I left and drove back home. On the way there, I stopped by the store and grabbed a cheap phone to use in the meantime. I was trying to make up my mind. Would I rather buy a new phone or get this person to be reasonable with me? I thought about offering them $100 or trying to negotiate, but that made me even more mad. I shouldn't have to pay them any money at all. I considered getting the police involved, but I didn't really think it was that serious of a matter. I got home at around 6 p.m. or so. I lived by myself in a pretty standard one-bedroom apartment. About an hour after returning home, though, there was a knock on my door. I walked over and looked through the peephole to see who was there. When I did, I saw a man standing outside the door. He was wearing a black jacket and a winter hat and sunglasses. He was also wearing a really thick scarf that was covering most of his mouth. It was winter time, so there was nothing about that was too strange. I realized, though, that this might be the guy who had my phone. He'd likely gotten my address from my phone itself, as that was how he'd gotten my contact information as well. I opened the door and said hello to him. I really couldn't tell much of what he looked like because of what he was wearing. He was a little bit shorter than me. He told me he had my phone and wanted $400 for it. Then he would give it back to me. He reached into his pocket and held my phone up for a second. I tried to reason with the guy. I asked him why he thought I would give him that much money. He said because he wanted it. I told him that was unreasonable, and it was my phone. My phone didn't even cost that much in the first place. The guy cursed at me, and out of nowhere tried to force his way into my apartment. I didn't have any time to stop him. I backed up but couldn't even try to close the door on him. He was already mostly inside. At that point, I turned and ran for the nearest room, which happened to be my bathroom. I was just a few feet ahead of the guy, but when I started running, I gained some distance on him. I got into the bathroom and slammed the door shut. I locked it too. The guy tried to force his way in seconds later. After an initial failed attempt, I heard him walk away. He was still inside my apartment, though. Luckily, I had the crappy phone I just bought at Walmart. I dialed 911 as I heard the man begin rummaging through my belongings. I told the police what was going on, and I was told some officers were on the way. Still, I was pretty scared being alone in my place with this guy. I heard him go into my bedroom, as well as the living room and kitchen. I hoped he wouldn't try to force the bathroom open again. Luckily, he didn't do so. He remained inside my apartment for 5 minutes. I heard him leave after. I stayed in the bathroom until police got there. They arrived about 5 minutes after the man left. When I went back out, I saw my apartment was pretty messed up. The guy was probably looking around for anything valuable I had. He did steal a few things. Luckily, my wallet was still on me. I told the police all the information I could, and they said they would look into it. Unfortunately, I never got my phone back. I still don't know who stole it. I've considered that it was possibly someone who works in my building that did it. My office building is very large, and multiple companies are in there. Lots of people go through that building, so that might be what happened. I really don't know for sure. I remember this one time I found a phone on the side of the road. I was driving home later at night, around 10 p.m. or so. Things were pretty quiet as I came to a stop at a red light. I casually looked around the intersection that I was at. It was usually busy during the day, but at night it was pretty much a ghost town. I was next to a divider that was on my left, and that's when I noticed something on the ground. It appeared to be someone's phone. I opened my door and looked closer, realizing it was in fact a cell phone. I picked it up. It had been raining outside, so the phone was pretty wet. I figured it would probably be broken. After looking closer, I saw it was an iPhone of some sort. I hit the button, and to my surprise, it actually turned on. After that, the light turned green. I had to finish driving home, but once I was back, I took that phone out and looked it over. Nothing appeared to be wrong with it. I wanted to return it to the rightful owner. The phone was obviously password protected, so I had no clue who it belonged to. I tried the 1234 thing and some other obvious ones, but none of them seemed to work. After that, I tried to use voice commands. I asked Siri who the owner of the phone was. She said the phone belonged to someone named Brian. I had a name now, but unfortunately it was a pretty common name. I tried to ask for Brian's contact information to get a hold of him, but I was told the phone had to be unlocked for that. That was the same for everything else as well. I tried a lot of other commands, but wasn't getting any results. I only had this one name to go off of. After that, I decided to make a post on Craigslist. I put that I'd found somebody's cell phone. I described the area where I found it and included a picture of it as well. I asked the owner to get in touch with me. Within a day, I got a reply. The first reply was someone claiming the phone was theirs. I asked them what their name was. Obviously, if they answered with anything other than Brian, I knew it wasn't theirs. The first person didn't want to give me their name and asked me why I wanted to know. I said because I knew the name of the person the phone belonged to, and I wanted to make sure it was really them. They told me their name was Joe, and I knew they weren't the real owner. Sometime later, I got another reply, somebody just saying that it was their phone. When I asked them their name, they said Brian. This was promising. Perhaps I really had found the owner. I was happy and couldn't believe it actually worked. I asked Brian where he wanted to meet up to pick his phone up. He told me he didn't want to cause me any trouble, and he could just stop by my house. When he said that, I thought maybe I shouldn't give him my address. But I told myself, I'm not selling anything here, I'm just returning someone's belongings to their rightful owner. I convinced myself it was fine. I gave Brian my home address, and he told me he would stop by at 8 p.m. to grab the phone. I agreed, and that night around 8, there was a knock on my front door. I went over and answered it. Brian was out there, or at least that's who I assumed he was. He had sort of short reddish hair and was about average height. I said hello to him and handed him the phone. He took it and asked me where I'd found it. I told him exactly where. Oh yeah? That's crazy. He then just kind of stood there. I was about to say have a good night and close the door, when randomly he asked me if he could come inside for a moment. I really didn't want him to. I knew nothing about this guy, and I certainly knew better than to let a random stranger into my home. Plus, I was the only one home at the time. I told him I was about to go to bed, and I started to shut the door. He just kept standing there looking at me. As I was about to close it, he said okay. I closed the door and locked it. Then I turned out the lights right inside. It didn't seem like Brian was walking away though. I went over to the living room window to look. When I did, I saw Brian just standing there on the front step, staring at my door. It was really weird. Probably 30 seconds later, he slowly walked back to his car that was parked on the side of the street. He got inside and I was about to walk away. I wanted to make sure he'd left though. I watched as he sat inside his car and didn't drive away. I kept watching. I wasn't going to leave until he did. For 20 minutes he just sat inside his car. Then he got out again and started walking back up to my front step. I had a bad feeling now. I didn't know what he could possibly want from me. I was expecting him to maybe knock on the door or something, but he didn't do that. Instead, he stood on the front step and looked around for a few seconds, then started to walk away to the side of the house. When he was out of sight, I finally moved. I went to another window. I went to my bedroom. When I got to it, I just barely saw him go out of sight and behind my house. Now he was in my backyard. Well, I didn't like this at all. I moved to another back window and turned on a backlight outside. When it went on, I saw Brian continuing to walk through my backyard over to the other side of my house. Then he casually walked around the back to the front yard. Once he was there, he returned to his car, started the engine, and drove away. I was really weirded out by this. He had made a complete lap around my house. After he drove away, he didn't come back that night. At least, not that I'm aware of. I still wonder what exactly he was doing. My best guess is that he was going to try and break in, and when I turned the light on and he was sure I was observing him, it scared him off from attempting it. I really don't know. Either way, it was fairly unnerving. Back in the early 2000s, the old elementary school sat abandoned at the edge of my hometown for months before renovations began. And by renovations, I mean completely tearing the whole thing down and building a new school on top of its corpse. Kind of a morbid metaphor for an elementary school, but it's the most accurate one. Now, something I've got to confess. It was my old elementary school. I was a little bit sad and mad they were going to tear it down. After all, I graduated from there and moved on to middle school. In the summer between 6th and 7th grade, I made a plan with my good buddy Troy to have one last expedition to our old haunt. We already knew that was illegal, okay, so don't feel the need to lecture me about it now. The plan was simple: sneak into the school at night and explore every inch of the place, especially the nooks and crannies we weren't allowed to go when it was open, like the teacher's lounge and the kitchen. Troy told me he wanted to see if he could nab some leftover desserts from the freezer. I was pretty sure they had already cleared everything out, and even if they hadn't, I wasn't sure it would be safe to eat. But I wasn't about to crush his little dreams. I wanted to see what happened behind the scenes in the office. Kind of lame, I know. Pretty soon, the first few weeks of summer flew right by, and the night of the plan finally came at the end of June. Being the sneaky 12-year-olds we were, we said we were planning on spending the night at each other's houses, but instead met up at the local gas station just down the street from the school. The building loomed as large as a mountain on the horizon to us. It was familiar, but also alien feeling. With our hearts pounding, we ran with each other to the edge of the playground. The entire school was surrounded by a very short chain-link fence that me and Troy used to climb all the time, so it was no sweat getting over it now. We played on the swings, the rope climbing thing, and the jungle gym, just like we did in the good old days. Which, were only a couple of months ago, but whatever. Troy did a few fancy flips and jumps off the swing, while I went head first down all the slides. Basically anything we'd normally get in trouble for at recess. I still remember the cold metal ridges catching my shirt and sliding over my stomach as I hurled to the ground over and over. Eventually, though, we got bored of the kiddie playground stuff and started searching for a way inside the school. Obviously, the doors were locked, so we started messing with the first floor windows. Looking to see if there were any other way inside. Eventually, I picked up a rock to break one, but Troy quickly stopped me. He said we didn't want to get in too much trouble if we were caught. On second thought, neither of us wanted to crawl into broken glass either. We soon found that we didn't need to force our way in anyway. A window had been left open after all. One leading right into the library. The space behind the window was nearly pitch black, except for the tiny reflections of moonlight off of book jackets along a shelf. Neither of us moved for a moment. In all our plan making, our tiny minds never thought the inside of our old school would be so creepy when it was empty. Neither of us thought it would take much gusto to take the first step inside, but there we were frozen in front of the open window. For the first time, I really thought of just how much trouble we'd be in if someone caught us going in. I pictured a spotlight turned on us and police cruisers pulling up in full force. I know that's kind of irrational for something so minor as trespassing kids, but that's just how kids are when they're young. It was exactly that fear that broke the trance and pushed me to start climbing through the window. And Troy tried to say something, but since I was already halfway in, he knew there was no going back. He kept quiet as he followed behind me. The windowsill was very dusty under my hands. The library carpet sent a cluster of dust right into my face. Who knew just how dirty a place could get after a month of disrepair? I heard Troy cough behind me, and I said sorry. Our voices echoed throughout the quiet library. We looked over the library quickly. That wasn't our main goal anyway. We headed out into the darkened hallway. Troy turned on his flashlight once he was sure there was no one milling about. The rows of lockers lit up in the darkness kind of looked like a setting in a horror movie, honestly. I kind of wanted to test and see if my old combination for my lock worked, but Troy punched my arm and challenged me to another race to the cafeteria. We ran down the empty hall. It was so freeing, being able to do all this on school grounds with no teachers to stop us. The cafeteria doors were wide open. Troy grabbed the door frame as he swung into the room. When I reached him, he was dead quiet though. I stopped to catch my breath, but he didn't brag or even say anything like usual. I finally looked at him to ask what was wrong. My mouth dried up when I saw his face. He looked paler than normal, and his mouth was opening and closing like a fish. I asked him what was wrong. He just pointed his flashlight toward one of the lunch tables. I was not prepared to see someone squatting down behind one and staring at us with these insanely crazy eyes. I didn't stick around to get any more details. I could see the guy was older and was holding some sort of syringe. I screamed as he stood up, and we both started to run. I'm not proud to say this, but I nearly shoved Troy to the ground to get out faster. Picture two 12-year-old boys swan diving out an open window, and from there booking it back to Troy's house. That's how scared we were of that guy. We spent the next few days talking everything over. The old guy was probably just a squatter of some sort, and didn't plan on hurting us, but we couldn't entirely be sure. He really looked crazy. We sure as heck didn't want to tell anyone and get in trouble, so we resolved to leave the whole situation behind us. I don't know if the delay in renovations was due to problems with people squatting inside the school, but I can imagine there's a good chance it was part of the problem. I never went back, not even to visit the new school when it was up and running. I, 21 and female, used to live in a really bad neighborhood when I was a kid. Drive-by shootings were not uncommon. Rapes had happened in surrounding houses while we lived there, and before we even moved, we also found out that the sweet man across the street was a registered sex offender. Obviously not a great place for children to be walking around alone, right? True. But if you have a 70-pound good boy that's completely dedicated to protecting you, it's somewhat doable. My mom, little brother in his stroller, me, and Spanky the good boy went for a walk around the neighborhood. It was about 2 blocks to go to the community pool. I, like most 6-year-olds, wanted to wander ahead with my dog. He was always gentle when I held the lead and walked close to me. As we were nearing the pool, there was a stretch of hedges that lined the walkway to the pool entrance. Spanky was walking ahead of me, about 3 feet or so. He sniffed towards a bush and came to a sudden stop. He began posturing and growling deeply, baring his teeth at this random bush. He had never growled like this before, and to me it was horrifying to see my best buddy like this. I tried to walk around him, but he turned the back end of his body to block me, his eyes still fixated on that bush. I tried again, and he blocked my path once more. My mom was about 4 houses behind, so she hadn't noticed this strange behavior yet. I could see the bush starting to move, and I took a step back. "Mom, I think Spanky found a kitty." I started to take a step towards the bush, but was knocked over completely by Spanky. I was crying on the ground. Scraped elbow, no biggie, but it got my mom running. Exactly at that moment, a man emerged from within the bush and took off running. When Spanky knocked me over, it made me drop his leash, so he immediately booked it after the guy. About 300 feet away, Spanky caught up with him and made some sickening contact with the guy's ankles and forearms. I've heard a lot of screams on TV and movies, but I had never heard such a blood-curdling scream as this before. My mom pulled me close and pulled out her phone, fingers shaking. While she was on the phone with 911, I could hear the man screaming, "Get him off me!" When the police arrived, they asked for a full version of events, and my mom and I gave details best we could. Mainly her, because 6-year-olds aren't great at descriptions, of course. Spanky was sitting very happily at our feet after the officers and my mom had removed him from the man's arm. The guy was taken away in cuffs. After a quick checkup in the ambulance, they found out he was fine, just a few real good bites. About 10 years later, I asked my mother about it. When I was looking through some old photo albums, I saw a picture of me and Spanky playing in the backyard. She sighed and said, "Oh, you know what happened. We don't need to talk about it." Well, yeah, but why would he attack some random homeless guy? My mom made a really confused face. I said, "What? That's what happened, right?" I guess I can tell you now. I didn't want to tell you back then because I didn't want to worry you. The man who Spanky pulled out of that bush had been spotted peeking into the houses in the neighborhood that had kids. It was the same guy that was hiding in the backyard when you had that sleepover at your friend's house. He had a knife he dropped when he ran from the bush. The police thought he might have been canvassing the neighborhood before he decided who to take. If it wasn't for Spanky, it might have been you. So yeah, basically this guy was a pedophile that had been spending weeks at night creeping into people's backyards that he knew had children. Most likely, he'd even done worse before. I live 300 miles from there now, and I could still not handle coming up to that stupid hedge if I tried. I'm not going to give my name or age, but I need to talk about a story that still impacts me to this day. First of all, my parents separated when I was 9 years old. A few months later, my mother met a guy who I'll call Kevin. At first, it was going very well. He played with my brother and me, he was really nice to my mother. It was like that until my mother got pregnant by this guy. When she told us, we were really happy. We were going to have a new sibling in the family. It must be said that at that time, I was seeing my father every other weekend, and despite everything I tried, he was going to be moving away from my brother and me. Suddenly, I had major abandonment wounds. Anyway, after my mother told us she was pregnant, she started looking for a new apartment that was a little bit bigger to accommodate more people. She quickly found one, but not in the same village where we were. We moved quite quickly and changed schools too. I was quite unsociable at the time, which meant it took me a long while to make new friends. After 9 months, my mother was in the hospital and gave birth to a little bean. At that point, things with my stepfather started to get really weird. For example, he started to throw insults aimed at me. I remember being locked in the bathroom for a good hour, with this guy on the other side of the door, telling me that if I came out, I would be dead. He started threatening to hit me and everything. At that time, I was 11 years old. My brother was not at home, as he was still in class. After the hour locked in the room, I finally came out when I no longer heard any noise outside. When I left, I went straight to my room. so as to not run into him again before having to go to school the next day. My mother, returning with the newborn, seemed to calm everything down, but it didn't last for long. So began a daily life for me punctuated with insults and the insinuations that my only use in life was to die. In this apartment, we decided to adopt a cat. This is a detail that stood out to me for a lot of reasons. So we adopted this cat, and he was very adorable and super cuddly. Unfortunately for him, being a baby still, he accidentally relieved himself on a sweater that belonged to Kevin. Since then, my stepfather began throwing him against walls and various other forms of violence. Eventually, my mother, brother, and I had to leave for 10 days. My mother decided to hand our cat to someone else, so we would not find it dead when they returned. About a year after that, we moved again, this time to be in a house. Things became much worse and much harder for me to bear. This man, if we can still call him that, started to put hands on me and forced me to sit on his knees as well. All while he started acting inappropriate toward me, he also began treating me like crap. I remember one sentence he said to me several times. The first time he threw it in my face was when I was getting yelled at for something I didn't even know. Being hypersensitive, I was in tears under the table when he said with a frightening composure, "Why don't you just die? No one wants you here. Go kill yourself, damn it." After hearing that, I tried not to think about it anymore. He started to get violent with my mother as well. He began to be drunk all the time. Whenever he left for work in the morning, he often came into my room, thinking I was still asleep, but it woke me up every time and had me laying there in fear. Despite my complaints to my mother, she never did anything about it. At that time, I no longer spoke in school for fear of getting yelled at just like I did when I was at home. I was very distant from everyone and tried to act like everything was fine. Things continued like this until their child started school. My mother decided to separate from this man and move back to the first village we initially lived at so the child could start school there. I remember just before moving, him taking me to the side, and before dropping me off, he said this to me, "Why are you mad at me? I never did anything to you." I'm gonna talk about the repercussions this man had on me, besides 2 times attempting suicide and stays at the hospital. After they separated, I had insomnia every night. I could only sleep 3 hours a night, waking up every 10 minutes. I was seen by 3 psychologists for many years until my first suicide attempt. Eventually, I was diagnosed with depression and discovered that I was hypervigilant at night. I'm still currently in severe depression and being sought after by psychologists to help me. It started in 5th grade. I wasn't a complex kid. I didn't have a phone, didn't use social media. I only had a tablet I could only use for certain times of day. My parents weren't super strict, and since I played outside all the time with my neighbors, I didn't really mind. It was to keep me from getting addicted to online games and developing a short attention span. To be honest, I'm grateful for the restrictions in hindsight. It made my peers' job of stalking me much harder. Anyway, there was a kid in my class named Damien, and he was kind of weird. I didn't know him for long, but he was the worst sort of boy. He'd pull at girls' bra straps in the middle of class, whoop at them, and tell the teacher the girls were always distracting him. He'd even tattle on you for everything, especially if you didn't include him in something. That's how all this started, at the beginning of October of 5th grade. My best friend at the time, who I'll call Jane, had a strange sense of humor like I did. She didn't have any electronics at all. When we were younger back in those days, there were these fake chat stories that were all the rage over YouTube. I wrote down a bunch of them with glitter pens and was going to give them to her the next day in class so she could have something fun to read that evening. Then we'd joke about it together the next day. In comes the annoying, irritating, obnoxious little boy Damien. He threw a fit about not being able to look at this present for my friend. It got to the point where I simply looked him in the eye and said, "It's about girl stuff, Damien. You wouldn't want to read it unless you want to know how periods work." Obviously, I was lying, but the kid demanded to read it anyway, as if he had a right to my personal belongings. I laughed at him and asked my teacher to use the restroom so I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. Surely he would calm down while I was gone. Apparently, while I was out though, Jane saw him rooting through my bag. He pulled out my gel-colored pens and started writing nasty things into the little packet I was going to give my friend. It was a bunch of inappropriate stuff about murdering, killing, fucking, and various other cuss words that would be considered inappropriate. When I came back, he ran to the teacher and tattled on me. He said I was threatening to kill his family and murder his friends if he told someone about it. Lo and behold, my teacher snatched the gift I was going to give to my friend, read through it, and then looked at me with anger and sent me to the office. Long story short, my parents were called, and I was suspended for 3 days because of Damien's lies. They said I threatened to harm another student, even though I never did. All the while, my friend kept telling him that Damien did it. Along with this, they also ended up giving me a whole 2 months worth of detention, 2 hours before lunch every day. This was all because, as I was talking to my friend, Damien decided to eavesdrop on our conversation and said I was spreading nasty rumors about some other girls in my grade. He said I wanted to hurt them. All I was doing was telling Jane some things I'd heard other girls saying about her. That was the second strike on my record. That's why there were so many detentions. My school was very strict. Now that I have some basic explanation out of the way, I can continue the main story. After both those instances, Damien continued to find little things to plant on me or rat me out with lies, really just bugging me in general. He went as far as to spread rumors that me and my best friend were lesbians dating, but I was cheating on her with another girl. I was straight as could be. I didn't really care about the rumors, but I was annoyed he'd roped my friend into it. Finally, it all came to a head in the next semester. We used to have to take 5-4-1 tests all the time, and on our little sheets we wrote down our scores and signatures from the teacher. We had our names and addresses on them as well, so they could send them to our parents at the end of the 9 weeks to show we were on track. Apparently, Damien copied down my address while I wasn't looking at one point, and proceeded to convince his parents to get their driver to go by my house to say hello to his friend. He would yell insults at me and throw mean notes into my yard. He was rich, by the way. He took pictures of me while I was outside playing with friends and showed me the next day with the quip that I couldn't outrun him and that he knew where I lived, so I better not make him mad. It got super creepy when he started to print out the photos of me and put them all in a little binder. I told my teacher and the principal about it, but they just told me that boys will be boys. That I shouldn't be looking into his private folders without his permission, like it should be allowed for him to take photos of me without my consent. You could even clearly see in them that I didn't know they were being taken. Even my own parents didn't believe me, saying I was just making it up to blame the kid that got me in trouble. I wasn't lying at all, but the adults all thought I was because I'd gotten into so much trouble that year, with little fault of my own. He kept harassing me, taking pictures, leaving things in my yard and my backpack. He even messed with me during tests at the computers. He would always sit too close to me in class, watch me at recess, and try to grab and touch me all the time. No matter how much I complained or told adults around me, they told me to be happy that a boy liked me that much. This kept happening all through 6th grade, and when it came to my first middle school dance, he got even worse. He tried to take photos of my dress, tried to steal one of my heels as well, and tried to steal money from my purse. I'm pretty sure he'd developed an obsession with me, as distorted as it was. He would comment about my body during the gym class we shared. He even began to complain to the teachers that I didn't wear shorts that showed off my ass enough when we got older. I remember him talking about how nice it was to look at me with a bloody nose and messed up hair. This is after I ran into the bleachers when playing Capture the Flag and tried to snatch it from his hands. He jumped up onto the bleachers out of bounds and tripped me, causing me to slam my head into them. That hurt like a bitch, mind you. After that comment, I tried telling the principal again. He didn't care, so I stopped trying. He continued with the behavior to the point that most days I couldn't bring myself to go to school. I would hide in the gym, locker room, bathrooms to avoid going out after roll call. I just didn't want to interact with him. At the end of 7th grade, he was caught with cigarettes, so his parents sent him off to military school. I bring up this whole story that was so long ago because recently he began trying to add me again on my socials. Obviously, I blocked him, but even now, nearly 5 years past that initial attempt, he still tries to get in touch with me. I don't think I'll be prepared for a day I have to see him again. I spend a lot of my spare nights doing deliveries for DoorDash. It's my way of getting some extra money, while also not needing to commit to a more strict second job. I started driving around 9 p.m. on this night and steadily took on orders until around 11. It slowed down a bit during that time, so I just kinda drove around the shopping center that had the most fast food restaurants people often ordered from. Eventually, another order came through. It was a regular order to be delivered about 4 miles away. After grabbing the food, I started the directions to the address. It was almost immediately apparent that this wasn't a house it was being delivered to. I zoomed in on the map, which only showed streets and buildings, and the address I pointed to was along a street that had no buildings on it whatsoever. It looked kind of like an empty plot of land, actually. The DoorDash map was never that great, though, so I just started driving and decided to at least check it out before I wrote it off. Maybe I'd call in to the customer if there was really an issue. I drove out there, taking just under 20 minutes, until I reached the street it was on. The street was very bare. There were no houses or crossroads, no cars driving on it. When I got to the end, it became a gravel road. Off to the side was a small wooden sign that was too weathered to even be legible. I pulled onto the gravel and turned my brights on. Right away, I could see something far off down the road. I drove in closer, and as I approached it, my phone dinged to let me know I'd arrived. In my headlights was a small mobile home, or some sort of RV. On the door were some poorly painted numbers. I looked back at my phone. 2760. It was the address. I got out holding the food in my hand. As I walked up to the RV, getting a closer look at it, it was a bit unsettling to look at. It was completely overgrown and old, which was strange considering it was a mobile home. Those were meant to be moving around, right? I gave it a knock and waited. This was a rare cash order, which made more sense once I saw the place, but I definitely didn't feel good having to stand there. As I looked around, an eerie feeling washed over me. This place was surrounded by woods, with no lights anywhere past the RV. It was complete darkness out there. I heard something from inside and prepared for them to open the door. Then a voice off to my right startled me. I looked over and saw a man just standing there smiling at me. He was by the corner of the RV. He asked me if I had his order. I nodded and apologized, walking it over to him. I handed it off and said his total. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill. He smiled again and said he just needed to grab the rest. He turned around and walked back around the RV while I stayed where I was. This whole interaction in writing doesn't seem as off as it was in person, but I can tell you, just by looking at this guy, I could tell something was very wrong with him. Something about the way he was acting and saying things. It just gave me chills. I waited for a minute or so before getting more and more nervous. I peeked around the corner to where he said he'd gone. In the distance, I could see a figure standing by what looked to be the dark outline of a shed. They were not moving at all. They were just standing there. As the fear grew inside my head, I jolted around. Hearing the door to the RV suddenly opening, a different man looked out at me. Just as I started to greet him, he slammed the door shut. My heartbeat was now intensifying. I looked back out at the man who was by the shed. He was walking back toward the RV, but now he had something different than money in his hands. I couldn't quite tell exactly, but it looked like he was carrying a rifle. I ran back to the car and jumped in. I turned it on with shaky hands and slammed it in reverse. The man came running around to the other side of the mobile home and then stood calmly in the darkness as I drove off. I don't know exactly what was happening there, but I wasn't exactly keen on finding out. I went straight home afterwards and debated calling 911. I was caught up on the fact that I didn't actually know what was going on, so in the end I made the regretful decision to not notify the police. Whatever happened that night will remain as just the strange encounter it was, with no answers to the true nature of it. Last year, I had a really creepy experience. For a little background, I live by myself and have a house. This was the same situation for when this story occurred. It all started when I was at home one night. It was around 9 or 10 p.m., I think. Usually, I stay up kind of late, so I wasn't about to go to bed anytime soon or anything. When I suddenly heard a knock on my front door, I did think that was a little unusual. I walked over and looked out the window to see who it was. There was a woman standing out there. I was unsure if I should answer the door or not. I waited to see if she would just walk away on her own, but about a minute later she knocked on the door again. I decided to answer and see what was going on. I opened up the door for her. She had long blonde hair and looked to be in her 20s or so. She was wearing a black sweatshirt. Immediately as I opened the door, she asked me if she could come inside. I asked her why, and the woman responded by saying there was some guy that was after her. I told her I could call the police for her, but she interrupted me and asked to come in again. I didn't let her. I suggested calling the police once more, but she simply said no. When I asked her why, she just turned around and walked away. Needless to say, I was pretty confused. I looked around trying to see if there really was any man outside searching for her or something. I didn't see anyone. The woman quickly hurried down the street and out of my sight. I went back inside after that, and then went to bed later. By the next day, I had completely forgotten about that encounter for the most part. I went to work as usual. After that, I was home again. It was later at night once more. I was in my living room when I happened to notice out of the corner of my eye in the window that someone was out front walking by it. It was the same woman from the night before. She was walking on the street in front of my house. I knew a lot of my neighbors, and I was not aware of this woman living in the neighborhood. I had never seen her before until the night prior. It was also unusual for people to walk on my side of the street in the first place. This was overall a very strange situation. When she arrived in front of my house, I saw her stop and look at it. I noticed that she seemed to be kind of idling and staring at it. She then seemed to notice me looking through the window at her. She kept walking past my house down the street over and over. I wasn't sure who she was or why she was hanging around my neighborhood all of a sudden. I thought maybe she had moved in down the street or something, but honestly I had no idea what this was. I saw her again the very next day. This time I was driving to work. I remember that after making it out of my neighborhood, a car was driving behind me for whatever reason. I looked at my mirror to the car behind me and saw that the driver looked an awful lot like the woman who I kept seeing. I was almost positive it was her, but she was wearing these gigantic sunglasses, so I couldn't quite see all of her face. I couldn't be 100%. It was strange to see her again, though. At first, I didn't even have the thought that she was following me in her car in my mind, but as I kept driving, I noticed her making all the turns I did. Eventually, I was 90% of the way to work, and she was still right behind me. Now, I was 99% sure it was the exact same woman. It took me 15 minutes to get to work, and when I got there, she pulled into the parking lot right after me. I was shocked. I knew she didn't work here, but when I drove to where I always parked, she drove through the lot a different way. Her car went out of my sight. I couldn't tell if she was parking or just driving away. I went into work and didn't see her for the rest of the time that I was there. I didn't see her when leaving either. Actually, for the next 2 days, I didn't see her at all. I became even more suspicious because of this. I kept glancing out my windows at night, trying to see if she was lurking about somewhere. I didn't see any sight of her. One night a bit later, once again I was home by myself, except this time it was much later at night, probably after midnight. I was actually just about to go to sleep and was lying in bed when I heard a loud noise coming from what sounded like outside, right near the back of my home. I got up and went to my doorway, and that's when I heard another loud noise. It was clear it was coming from the back window. Somebody was hitting it with something. I didn't know who it was or what they were doing, so I stayed in my bedroom and closed my door. I then called the police and told them that somebody was trying to break into my home. A short time later, I heard more loud noises, and it sounded like someone had made their way inside my home. I stayed in my room and quickly locked the door. Whoever was inside my house walked around, but I soon heard them opening every doorway. They didn't get close to my bedroom, though, before I stopped hearing any noises. It took me a while to realize they'd likely gone into my basement. For the next 5 minutes or so, everything was silent. Then the police arrived. I ran out of my room to let them in. Once they entered, I let them know I thought somebody was in my basement. They went down there, and a short time later came out with the same woman who I'd kept seeing. I should have known it was her the whole time. I was glad she wouldn't be bothering me anymore, but I never got an answer as to why she was doing all this. She refused to say, and in the end, I never found out anything more. I wanted to share this story to warn people. It's a story that's really weird and freaked me out. I'm traveling around the country in my car. I've been driving for over a week from the city I lived in, and so far I've slept in my car to save money. It wasn't until I got to a big enough city that I decided to treat myself to an actual bed that would be comfortable. I opted to choose Airbnb because it's cheaper than hotels. I booked this particular Airbnb the day before I arrived to the city, so there weren't many options. I had found this apartment that looked very new and modern. It was in a great location, and the price was decent as well. Actually, it seemed almost too good to be true. The only downside was that it was listed as a new listing, and so it had 0 reviews. I figured the price was low because it was a new listing, and decided to give it a shot. It must be legit because it's on Airbnb, right? When I got to the apartment building, it was older looking than I expected. I later found out that my Airbnb was most likely the only renovated apartment in the entire building. The rest seemed to be in very poor condition. It looked like a dorm hall more than an apartment building, really. I let it slide though because I wasn't paying too much, so what could I really expect? The apartment itself looked like the pics, so that was good enough for me. Everything went well for the first 2 days. As a woman traveling alone, I always make sure to be safe. I don't go out when it's too dark. I always lock the door. I lock every single lock, including the chain. Anyway, on the 3rd day, I was out all morning and came back to the apartment to change to head to the beach. I had again locked the door, including the chain. I was in front of the door watching TV while changing, when all of a sudden the door started to unlock and someone tried to open it. I was beyond lucky I had remembered to put the chain lock on the door, or else it would have opened right away. I was naked, and no one else was supposed to have keys to this room. My first reaction was, "Excuse me?" I closed the door right away and locked it again. I didn't see who was trying to open it while I did this. I sat in front of the door, scared and shocked. I realized this person could still get in there any time, since obviously they had a key to this apartment. At first, I thought maybe it was the owner coming back after I checked out, but I was not supposed to check out until the following day, so that couldn't be it. After crying for a few minutes, I recuperated myself. I called the owner and told her what happened. She told me that no one else was supposed to have a set of keys other than her, and that she was at work and she couldn't possibly be there. I was scared to stay in the apartment because someone could come in at any time. I also didn't want to leave though, because I had all my valuables there. It was a lose-lose situation, really. I called my dad, who told me it was not okay that someone had the keys, and she needed to take care of this ASAP. He talked to the owner, and she told me she would be there shortly with a locksmith to change it and give me a new pair of keys. She proceeded to tell me that she had only had this apartment for 6 months, and before I'd stayed there was only one other Airbnb booking. She mentioned it had been sitting empty other than those 2 bookings because she had been renovating the apartment. She told me the only possibility for who it could be was the previous owners or someone related to them. I'm pretty sure that's illegal. That possibility really messed with me. How was it possible that I was gone all day every day, and in the 10 minutes I happened to be home during the daytime, that was when someone tried to come in? How did they know I was there? Were they coming to rob me, or something else entirely? If this apartment had been sitting empty for half a year nearly, maybe this was something they did frequently, or maybe they wanted to do something to me in particular. These questions are constantly on my mind. I just know I'm lucky I put the keychain on the door, or else I don't even want to think about what they could have done to me. Needless to say, I will not be leaving a good review, and I won't be staying in an Airbnb that has no reviews or seems too good to be true from now on. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.